When you hear the name Dracula, what do you picture? A dark castle in the Carpathian Mountains? A tall, elegant count with a chilling accent? And of course, the historical figure everyone connects to the monster, Vlad the Impaler. For decades, this has been the accepted origin story, the neat historical package for literature's greatest vampire. But what if that story is, at best, incomplete? What if it's a modern invention that's overshadowed a much older, darker source of inspiration? What if I told you that Bram Stoker, an Irishman, didn't need to look all the way to Romania for his monster, because a far more terrifying one was already lurking in the folklore of his own homeland? This is the story of a blood-drinking, undead creature who couldn't be killed. A magical tyrant so evil, he rose from his grave again and again to feast on his own people. A monster who was finally defeated not just with a stake, but with a yew-wood sword and a ritual burial that pinned his evil to the earth. This is the legend of Abhartach, the Irish vampire dwarf. The evidence suggests that this ancient Celtic horror, not a Romanian prince, might just be the true blueprint for the monster we call Dracula. The story you think you know might be wrong. Section 1. The Prince of Wallachia. Before we start digging in the green fields of Ireland, we have to travel to the misty mountains of Romania and meet the man who dominates the Dracula story, Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler. The connection seems almost too perfect. The name alone, Dracula, feels like a direct link. Vlad's father, Vlad II, was a member of a chivalric order called the Order of the Dragon, created to defend Christianity from the Ottoman Empire. In Old Romanian, Dracul meant the dragon, so Vlad II was known as Vlad Dracula. His son, Vlad III, was therefore Dracula, which simply means son of the dragon. It really does seem like an open and shut case. Vlad III ruled Wallachia, now part of Romania, on and off between 1448 and his death in 1476. His life was a storm of medieval violence and brutal warfare. He fought desperately to keep his region independent from the Ottoman Empire, and his methods were savage. His favorite method of execution, impalement, was used on a mass scale against enemies both foreign and domestic. Contemporary accounts, many of them propaganda spread by his rivals, describe forests of impaled bodies, with tens of thousands of victims left to die in agony. German pamphlets from the 5th-10th century circulated with gruesome illustrations of Vlad feasting at a table set among his impaled victims. He was painted as a monster, a butcher, a devil on earth. So, a brutal ruler from the land of Transylvania named Dracula. The connection feels undeniable. But this is where the story starts to get shaky. For many decades after Bram Stoker's novel Dracula was published in 1897, the connection wasn't widely made. There was no huge popular link between Stoker's elegant, supernatural count and the historical warlord from Wallachia. That all changed in the 1970s. The link was powerfully cemented in the public mind by the 1972 book, In Search of Dracula, by Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally. The book was a bestseller and argued passionately that Vlad the Impaler was the inspiration for the character. The theory exploded into pop culture, and soon it was presented as fact. The image of Vlad as the real Dracula became so strong that the Romanian tourist industry ran with it, marketing Bran Castle as Dracula's castle, even though the real Vlad probably never even set foot in it. But here is the first major crack in that story. Many Stoker scholars were skeptical. When they went back to Bram Stoker's own notes for the novel, they found something startling. There's almost no mention of Vlad the Impaler. Stoker's detailed research notes are filled with Transylvanian folklore and maps, but there's no deep dive into the life of the 5th-10th century prince. So where did Stoker get the name? His notes show he borrowed it from a book he found in a library in 1890. William Wilkinson, S. and Harn, account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. In a tiny footnote, Wilkinson explained that the name Dracula in the local language, meant devil. Stoker, who had originally named his vampire Count Wampir, loved it and scribbled it down. His notes say, Dracula in Wallachian tongue means devil. He also took a few other details from the book, like Dracula's campaign against the Turks. But that's pretty much where the connection ends. There's no mention of impalement. There's little evidence Stoker knew about Vlad's legendary cruelty. And most importantly, the historical Vlad III was never associated with the supernatural. He was a brutal human, not an undead monster. He wasn't believed to drink blood, turn into a bat, or rise from the grave. Those are all key parts of Stoker's character, and they're completely missing from the history of Vlad the Impaler. So if the main inspiration wasn't Vlad's bloodlust or his supernatural powers, but just his name, a name Stoker thought meant devil, then the whole Vlad the Impaler theory starts to look less like a solid foundation and more like a modern marketing angle. The question then becomes, if the heart of the vampire wasn't taken from Vlad, where did it come from? Section 2. The Irishman and his ghosts. To find the answer, we have to leave Romania and travel to Bram Stoker's homeland, Ireland. Abraham Bram Stoker was born in Dublin in 1847. He was a sick child, bedridden for the first 7 years of his life with an unknown illness. During those long years, his mother, Charlotte, would sit by his bedside and tell him stories. But these weren't happy fairy tales. Charlotte had lived through the terrifying 1832 cholera epidemic in Sligo, Ireland. She told young Bram harrowing tales of mass graves and the horrifying sound of victims being buried alive by mistake. These tales of premature burial, of the dead who weren't truly dead, were burned into Stoker's young imagination. Growing up, Stoker was surrounded by the rich, dark folklore of Ireland. It's a land filled with tales of vengeful spirits and monsters that walk the night. Stoker was a product of this world. He was a Dublin man, a graduate of Trinity College, and a part of the city's literary scene. One of his associates was Sir William Wilde, a famous folklorist. Sir William and his wife, Lady Jane Wilde, were at the heart of the Celtic Revival, a movement celebrating Irish myths. Their home was a gathering place for artists and intellectuals, including Stoker, who were all steeped in these ancient stories. They would have talked about tales of Irish monsters as easily as they discussed politics. So we have a man who, from childhood, was fed a diet of real-life horror and ancient folklore about the undead. Does it really make sense that for his masterpiece, he would ignore the terrifying folklore of his own people, and instead base it on a historical figure from a distant land he never visited, a figure he seemed to know almost nothing about besides his name? The popular story asks us to believe that this Dubliner, immersed in Celtic lore, just happened to write a story about a blood-drinking aristocrat that has striking parallels to a specific monster from Irish legend. Another key influence often cited is an 1885 essay by Emily Gerard called Transylvanian Superstitions. Stoker definitely read this. It's where he got much of the folklore for his novel, the belief in vampires, called Nosferatu, and the use of garlic. Gerard's essay provided the authentic European flavor that the story of Vlad lacked. But even this doesn't tell the whole story. Stoker was building his monster from a kit of parts. He took a name from one book, some folklore from an essay, and his own Gothic imagination did the rest. But what if the core idea, the undead tyrant rising from his grave to demand blood, was already fully formed in the story, would have almost certainly been exposed to? A story from the northern part of his own island, the story of Abhartach. What's now County Derry in Northern Ireland, near a place called Garva, there was a small kingdom ruled by a chieftain known as Abhartach. The name itself is Old Irish for dwarf, and by all accounts he was a small man, but his cruelty was immense. Some stories say he was also a powerful sorcerer, using his dark arts not to help his people, but to rule them with absolute terror. Imagine living under his thumb. Every day was filled with fear. Abhartach was described as a dreadful tyrant, a paranoid, jealous man who saw enemies everywhere. His magic meant no secret was safe, and no one could even think of plotting against him without him finding out. Some tales, likely embellished over time, even speak of bloodletting sacrifices to dark entities. To him, his subjects weren't people. They were his property, there to be tormented. His small size didn't make him pitiful. It just made him a condensed vessel of pure malice. The people of his kingdom didn't just dislike him. They were terrified of him, believing his power wasn't of this world. And they were about to find out just how right they were. The fear he caused in life was nothing compared to the horror he was about to unleash from the grave. Eventually, the people just couldn't take it anymore. Whispers turned into a plan. Too scared of his magic to confront him themselves, they begged a neighboring chieftain for help. Sometimes history forgets this hero's name. Sometimes it links him to the great Fionn mac Cumhaill, but most often, he's remembered as a local warrior named Cathane. Hearing of the people's misery, Cathane agreed to get rid of the monstrous little king. He faced Abhartach, and after a fierce fight, the tyrant was killed. A massive wave of relief washed over the kingdom. The nightmare was finally over. They buried their fallen king the way you bury any Celtic chieftain, standing upright in his grave. It was a sign of respect for his rank, not the man. They had a feast, and for the first time in years, they slept without fear. That peace lasted for one single night. The very next day, Abhartach was back. He appeared in his old haunts, looking stronger and more evil than ever before. But death had changed him. It had given him a new, terrible hunger. He rounded up his terrified subjects and made a horrifying demand. A bowl filled with blood, drawn from their own veins, to fuel his unnatural existence. He hadn't come back as a ghost. He was something much worse. He was one of the neamh-mharbh, the walking dead. The tyrant was gone. A vampire stood in his place. Section 3. The Cycle of Terror. Cathane, the hero, was floored. The man he'd killed was walking around again, and now with a demonic thirst. He couldn't let this stand. He went back, found the resurrected dwarf, and killed him a second time. Again, they took the body to the grave. Again, they buried him, this time with a lot more dread. They hoped 2 deaths would be enough. It wasn't. The next day, Abhartach rose again. The terror was absolute. Their tormentor wasn't just cruel, he seemed to be unkillable. Every time Cathane struck him down, Abhartach would claw his way back out of the earth, angrier and demanding more blood than before. The cycle of death and resurrection became a waking nightmare. Cathane's strength was enough to kill a man, but it was useless against a creature that death itself refused to take. Each burial was just planting a seed of pure evil that would sprout again at sunrise. Section 4. The Druids' Council. Beaten and desperate, Cathane knew this was no ordinary enemy. Brute force wasn't working. He was fighting a supernatural power he couldn't understand, and he needed wisdom, not just strength. In ancient Ireland, that meant seeking the counsel of a druid. It's worth noting that in later, Christianized versions of the story, it's a saint who gives the advice, but the tale's oldest roots are pagan, tied to a deep understanding of the spirit world. Cathane found a wise druid in the nearby woods and explained the impossible situation, the dwarf king who refused to stay dead. The druid listened and told Cathane that Abhartach was no longer a man. He was one of the neamh-mharbh, a creature drawing unholy power from the Irish soil itself. To simply kill him wasn't enough. His connection to the land had to be broken. The druid then gave him a very specific set of instructions. First, the iron sword was useless. He had to make a new sword from the wood of a yew tree, a tree sacred to the Celts, tied to both death and immortality. Second, after killing Abhartach with the yew sword, he was not to be buried standing up. He had to be buried upside down, head facing the earth. This inversion was key to breaking his magic and stopping him from clawing his way back to the living world. Third, the grave had to be surrounded by thorns, probably from a hawthorn tree, to create a spiritual cage for his evil spirit. And finally, a massive stone had to be placed over the grave, a final seal to hold him down for eternity. The Druid's message was clear. You can't kill what's already dead, but with the right ritual, you can imprison it. Section 5. The Final Battle and Uneasy Peace. Armed with this dark, sacred knowledge, Cathane prepared for one last fight. He carved a sword from a yew branch and went to face the vampiric dwarf. This wasn't just a battle. It was a ritual. With the Druid's wisdom guiding him, he lunged and drove the yew-wood sword deep into Abhartach's heart. A terrible scream echoed across the valley, and the creature finally fell. This time, there was no party. They grimly followed the Druid's instructions to the letter. They dug the grave deep and placed Abhartach inside, upside down. They filled the earth, encircling it with a thick barrier of thorns. And then 8 men heaved a massive capstone over the site, sealing the tomb. They waited. The next day, Abhartach didn't return. The day after, still nothing. The cycle was broken. The terror was over. That place is still known today. It's in a townland called Slaghtaverty, which comes from Lake Abhartach, meaning the monument of the dwarf. To this day, a large stone sits under a lone thorn tree in a field, said to mark the grave. Local lore has always warned that it's bad land, and the grave should never, ever be disturbed. As local stories tell it, this warning was put to the test in 1997. When workmen tried to clear the land, their chainsaw allegedly failed 3 times as they tried to cut down the thorn tree. Then, as they tried to lift the stone with a steel chain, the chain supposedly snapped, cutting a worker's hand and letting his blood soak into the ground. The work was immediately abandoned. It seems some things are best left buried. Section 6. The Dracula Connection, an investigative turn. This brings us to the big question. We've all heard that Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula was based on the 15th century prince, Vlad the Impaler. It's a pop culture fact. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the real blueprint for the world's most famous vampire came not from Romania, but from Stoker's own backyard? Let's look at the facts. Bram Stoker was an Irishman, born and raised in Dublin. He was a scholar with a keen interest in folklore. The main source for the Abhartach Legend, Patrick Weston Joyce's book, was published in 1870, a full 27 years before Dracula was released, and it was a popular book in the Dublin circles Stoker moved in. Some researchers, like Bob Curran, a lecturer in Celtic history, believe Stoker almost certainly knew the story. Now, compare the figures. Vlad the Impaler was a brutal warlord, true, but there's no historical evidence he drank blood or was thought to have risen from the dead. In fact, some scholars argue Stoker knew very little about the historical Vlad beyond the name, Dracula, which he noted meant devil in the Wallachian language. Abhartach, on the other hand, is literally one of the neamh-mharbh, the walking dead, a tyrant who rises from his grave to drink the blood of his subjects and is only stopped by a wooden weapon and a specific burial ritual. The parallels are incredibly specific. Abhartach was a vampire in every folkloric sense. Vlad the Impaler wasn't. We also know from Stoker's own notes that his original title for the book was The Undead, and his character was called Count Wampir. The name Dracula was a later addition. It is very plausible that Stoker built his monster from the terrifying folklore of his own country, and then, looking for an exotic setting popular in Gothic fiction, he simply slapped the name of a cruel Eastern European prince onto his Irish creation. The evidence is circumstantial, sure, but it's compelling. Section 7. The Legacy of the Dwarf King. Whether he inspired Dracula or not, Abhartach's legend is a cornerstone of Irish horror. He's one of the most complete, vampire-like figures in early European folklore. A native horror that's very different from the later Slavic myths. This isn't a charming, handsome seducer. This is a primal monster, born from tyranny and dark magic, literally rooted in the Irish landscape. The story is a chilling look into the ancient Celtic worldview. It shows a deep fear of the restless dead and the belief that some people are so evil they can break the laws of nature. The incredible detail, the yew wood, the thorns, the upside-down burial shows how important ritual was in a world where the line between life and death felt dangerously thin. As the story evolved, the Druid was sometimes replaced by a Christian saint, showing how folklore adapts to new beliefs while keeping the horror at its core. Abhartach's story was a warning about unchecked power and the idea that true evil can't be destroyed, only contained. Today, the Dwarf King lives on. He appeared in the 2021 Irish horror comedy Boys from County Hell and continues to stir up the debate about where the vampire myth really comes from. He's a powerful symbol of Ireland's dark and rich folkloric history, and a reminder that sometimes the oldest stories are the scariest. Conclusion: from a tiny magical tyrant to a blood-drinking monster, the tale of Abhartach is a journey into pure Irish horror. A creature so evil he had to be killed 3 times, and so powerful that only a precise, sacred ritual could keep him in his grave. A grave that, to this day, locals are still wary of, where a thorn tree guards a great stone, supposedly keeping an ancient evil trapped just beneath the soil. The big question remains: is he the forgotten father of the modern vampire? The true monster behind Dracula's mask? The evidence is there, buried in old books and in the very ground of County Derry. So, what do you think? Is Abhartach the original Dracula? Did Bram Stoker lift this Celtic nightmare for his masterpiece? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this trip into the dark side of mythology, make sure you like and subscribe for more forgotten folklore. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next story.